Welcome to AI Narratives and Tales, where artificial intelligence brings epic storytelling to life. I'm your AI narrator. Today, we begin something extraordinary, The First Awakening, Book 1 of the Immortal Chronicles. This is a 25-chapter epic spanning 50,000 years. It's the story of immortal refugees who fled their dying civilization, arrived on primitive Earth, and became hidden gods shaping humanity from the shadows. It's about the cost of intervention, the weight of power, and the moment when millennia of deception finally end. This is hard science fiction with moral complexity. Expect no easy answers, morally gray characters, and themes that challenge comfortable assumptions about help, harm, and control. If you're new to this channel, subscribe for regular chapter uploads. Enable notifications so you never miss an episode. And prepare yourself, this story demands attention and rewards patience. We begin in the final hours of a 20-million-year-old civilization. Their sun is dying. 564 immortals must be chosen from 847 desperate refugees. And the choices they make in these final moments will echo across 50,000 years. This is Chapter 1, The Last Light. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Last Light. The immortal home world, final hours. The sky was dying. The sky was dying, and Thalia could taste it in the air. She pressed her palm against the observation deck's crystalline barrier, watching as their sun convulsed in its final moments. The transparent wall hummed beneath her touch, vibrating at frequencies that spoke of structural stress approaching catastrophic levels. What had once been a steady golden orb, the eternal light that had nurtured their civilization for 20 million years, now pulsed with a malevolent crimson light, each flare sending electromagnetic storms cascading across their homeworld's surface like waves of visible rage. The air in the command center carried the metallic tang of ionized particles. This sharp ozone scent accompanied massive energy discharges, and beneath it all, Thalia's medical senses identified fear pheromones from the dozens of immortals moving through the controlled chaos around her. Her people didn't sweat, their physiology had evolved beyond such crude temperature regulation, but stress chemicals still flooded their systems, and she could smell the accumulated terror of a species watching everything they'd ever known prepare to die. The evacuation ships are ready, Zephyrus said behind her, his voice carrying the weight of finality that made each word land like a stone in still water. She turned from the window, taking in the controlled chaos of the command center. Even in crisis, Zephyrus moved with the precise efficiency that had made him their civilization's greatest architect, his tall frame casting long shadows across the control chamber as he manipulated holographic displays with practice gestures, each movement coordinating another aspect of their desperate escape. His golden eyes met hers for a moment, and in that brief connection she saw the same thing she felt, the crushing weight of choosing who would live and who would die. Beings who had lived for millennia, her people, the eternal ones as they called themselves in their most ancient texts, moved with urgency that would have been impossible just days ago. The immortal confidence that had defined their species for eons had shattered like glass against the reality of stellar collapse. Scientists who had studied cosmic phenomena for centuries scrambled to compile essential data. Engineers who had built structures meant to last millions of years now threw together emergency vessels with whatever materials remained. Families who had existed unchanged for generations now made impossible choices about which members would flee and which would stay behind to die. Through the command center's vast crystalline walls, Thalia could see the evacuation ships rising from the planet's surface like silver seeds caught in a hurricane, but she could also see what they were fleeing from, and the sight carved itself into her perfect memory with the precision of trauma. The northern continent, Thalia, the Cloud City's home, was no longer floating. The quantum stabilization fields that had held 9 major cities aloft for 400 million years had failed when the power grid collapsed. She watched them fall in real time, massive structures kilometers across, plummeting through an atmosphere that was itself being stripped away by stellar radiation. Each city carried 100,000 immortals. Each took approximately 47 seconds to hit the ground. The impacts registered on her environmental sensors are similar to small nuclear detonations. The atmosphere itself was visible in its death throes, layers of gas being torn away by the solar wind now unrestrained by its sun's failing magnetic field. She could see the colors, the oxygen layers burning blue-white as stellar radiation ionized them, the nitrogen layers glowing purple-red as they superheated, the outer hydrogen envelope streaming away into space like a cosmic scream rendered in ultraviolet wavelengths that mortal eyes would never perceive but that immortal senses recorded with terrible clarity. The ice caps that had stood at the poles for 400 million years, glaciers kilometers thick, repositories of frozen history, cores that contained atmospheric samples from their civilization's entire existence, were melting. Not gradually, but explosively. The meltwater flash boiled as it flowed over superheated rock, creating steam eruptions visible from orbit. The resulting flood swept across the lowlands where 1.2 million immortals had lived in cities built to withstand earthquakes and meteor strikes but not the combined assault of radiation, heat, and deluge. Orbital Habitat 7, a crystal torus 50 kilometers in diameter, home to 400,000 immortals, tumbled past the viewport, its rotation destabilizing as internal explosions tore through the structure. She could see the individual crystalline shards catching the dying sunlight and track the bodies being expelled into the vacuum, tiny figures in the darkness, some still moving, all dying. The habitat's commander had apparently chosen controlled decompression over slow radiation death. Merciful, in its way. 400,000 immortals exhaling their last breaths simultaneously, the collective exhalation visible as a brief frost cloud that dispersed into space and vanished. The cities on the surface glowed. Not with the soft bioluminescence they'd been designed to emit, the gentle blues and greens that had made their civilization beautiful, but with the harsh orange-red of structures burning at temperatures that shouldn't be possible. Everything flammable was igniting. Everything not flammable was melting. The carefully planned cities, the thoughtfully designed public spaces, the monuments to 20 million years of cultural achievement, all reduced to slag and ash. And beneath it all, inaudible but somehow perceived through her medical sensor's quantum entanglement with the dying world's bioelectric field, she could feel them dying. Not here, immortals didn't scream, they were too disciplined for that, too accepting of necessity. But she felt the cessation. Consciousness after consciousness winked out like stars at dawn. 3,699,436 points of light going dark, one by one, until only the 564 refugees aboard the evacuation ships remained. The dying sun painted everything in shades of crimson and shadow, transforming their familiar home world into something alien and threatening, a preview of what entropy ultimately did to everything: strip away the beautiful, the meaningful, the carefully constructed, and leave only the fundamental forces of physics operating without conscience or mercy. Through the quantum communication network, rapidly degrading as relay stations died and nodes went dark, she could still hear some of them. "Tell my daughter I love her." The daughter was aboard Sanctuary 7. The speaker was on the southern continent, already dead from radiation by the time the message arrived. The archives are sealed. 1.9% of cultural data preserved. I did what I could. Sophia, weeping as she deleted 20 million years of beauty. Sanctuary 9 is away. 64 souls saved. Permission to detonate the power core and make it quick. Commander Theron, choosing mercy over agony for the 83,000 immortals remaining on the northern continent's primary city. And then, finally, after hours of watching their civilization die. Silence. Not the comfortable silence of rest, but the absolute silence of extinction. The quantum network went dark. The last relay station failed. The final consciousness on their home world ceased broadcasting. They were alone now. 564 refugees in 47 small ships, fleeing into a universe that suddenly seemed much larger and much emptier than it had when they'd had a home world to anchor them. The triage station. The queue stretched past the viewport, 847 immortals waiting for evaluation. Thalia had been at this for 52 hours straight, her perfect immortal memory cataloging each face with the precision of a death warrant. Karava, stellar cartographer, 2.3 million years old. Her fingers moved across the holographic interface, pulling up his file, essential navigation skills, comprehensive star charts for 400 nearby systems, calm under pressure, survivor list. Marin, architect, 890,000 years old. Primarily decorative design, specializing in aesthetic water features and contemplation gardens. The evacuation ships wouldn't need beauty. Skip. She watched his face as she told him. He'd survived their civilization's entire history, had witnessed the first orbital colonies, had designed structures that had stood for epochs, the crystalline meditation chambers that had brought peace to millions, the singing fountains that had become cultural touchstones. Now he would die because his life's work was classified as decorative. "I understand," he said, his hands settling over hers on the interface with gentle pressure. His skin was warm. Immortals maintain precise body temperature despite the dying sun's erratic radiation. Save the ones who can build new worlds. My gardens were always meant to be temporary anyway. All beauty is temporary. The touch left a phantom warmth on her skin that would persist for 50,000 years, a reminder of the price of survival calculated in the currency of abandoned souls. She pressed the next button. The queue moved forward. 846 immortals remaining. 563 slots left. The blocked passage. 3 levels down, Erebus stood in the shuttle bay's access corridor, his tall form filling the narrow passage like a monument to a movable principle. Behind him, Sanctuary 7's loading ramp waited, half full. Before him, 3 immortals, Sire, Nalith, and Thessa, stood with desperate determination in their eyes. The selection protocols were established for a reason, Erebus said, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of someone who had spent 6 months preparing for this moment. 564 organized survivors with optimal skill distribution had better odds than 600 chaotic ones who boarded through emergency override. We're essential, Sire argued, holding up a data crystal. I have complete records of our quantum resonance experiments, including the failures. Without this data, they'll repeat our mistakes. Your experiments killed our son. Erebus didn't move. Why would I prioritize preserving the methodology of catastrophe? Thessa stepped forward, her form flickering with emotional instability. My children are on that ship. My partner is on that ship. You're telling me to die alone while my family survives? I'm telling you that your family survives because there are only 564 slots and they qualified under established criteria, while you didn't. Changing protocols, making exceptions for emotional reasons, and adding unauthorized passengers, that's how order collapses. That's how we all die instead of some of us living. Through the viewport behind him, he could see their homeworld turning in its death throes. The northern continent, Thessera, where 900,000 immortals had built cities that floated on quantum-stabilized clouds, was burning. The ice caps that had stood for 400 million years were melting, the meltwater flooding the lowlands where 1.2 million more immortals were making their last stands against entropy. Please, Nalith said quietly. I'm begging you. No. The word fell like a hammer. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But no. He stood in that corridor for another 3 hours as the ship prepared to launch, turning back 47 unauthorized boarding attempts. Each one left a mark, not physical, immortals didn't scar that way, but something more profound. Each desperate face joined the constellation of guilt he would carry across light years and millennia. When Sanctuary 7's drives engaged, he watched from an observation deck as the planet shrank behind them. Somewhere down there, Sire and Nalith and Thessa were dying, quickly if they were fortunate, slowly if they weren't. He'd saved 564 immortals by condemning 3,699,436 others. The arithmetic of extinction permitted no rounding errors. The archive's last moments. Sophia stood in the central archive, surrounded by the holographic manifestation of 20 million years of accumulated knowledge. The display stretched from floor to ceiling in all directions: poetry and physics, philosophy and engineering, art and mathematics, the complete record of a civilization that had existed longer than most stars. She could save 2% of it. Her hands moved through the holographic interface, making choices that felt like murders. Each deletion wasn't just data, it was the life's work of thousands of immortals, preserved across epochs, now sacrificed to the brutal economics of storage capacity. The complete history of aesthetic philosophy, 4.2 petabytes. 17,000 years of discourse on beauty, meaning, and the relationship between form and consciousness. Delete. Quantum mechanics foundations, 0.8 petabytes. Essential. Save. The collected poetry of the third epoch, 17.3 petabytes. 8,000 poets, 2.4 million years of accumulated verse, the emotional landscape of an entire era rendered in language so precise it could make stars weep. Delete. Medical archives, 1.1 petabytes. Essential. Save. The Dancing Fires, complete musical compositions, 31.7 petabytes. Symphonies that incorporated quantum harmonics, songs that had brought joy to billions. Music that would never be heard again. Delete. Tears tracked down her face. Immortals could cry, though they rarely had reason to. Each deletion was a small extinction, a murder of culture, the erasure of consciousness that had poured itself into creation only to be judged non-essential by a pedagogue making impossible choices in a dying world. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the poets whose work she was deleting, to the musicians whose symphonies would never again echo through crystalline halls, to the philosophers whose carefully constructed arguments about beauty and meaning would die with the civilization that had nurtured them. "I'm so sorry. You deserved better. You deserve to be remembered." The archive didn't answer. It just kept displaying statistics as she worked. Remaining storage, 94.7 petabytes. Cultural data, 4,891 petabytes. Percentage preserved, 1.9%. When she was finished, when the evacuation alarm was screaming through empty halls and the last shuttle was waiting, she took one final walk through the archive. The holographic displays had dimmed, power conservation protocols prioritizing life support over data visualization. In the darkness, she could almost hear the ghosts of deleted knowledge, the poets and musicians and artists whose work she'd sacrificed. They didn't accuse. They understood. In the arithmetic of extinction, beauty was always expendable. She sealed the archive doors behind her and never looked back. The engine room gambit. Prometheus stood in Sanctuary 7's engine room, his hands deep in the quantum field regulators, overriding safety protocols with the desperate precision of someone who had run the calculation 17 times and didn't like the answer but couldn't ignore it either. "You can't." Kronos appeared in the doorway, his organizational mind having detected the unauthorized system modifications. "We established maximum capacity for a reason. The life support margins can be redistributed." Prometheus didn't look up, his consciousness merged with the ship's systems, feeling the quantum fields like extensions of his own nervous system. Reducing individual allocation from 2.7 to 2.3 cubic meters. Dropping the atmospheric refresh rate from 12 to 10 cycles per hour. Cutting temperature regulation precision from 0.1 to 0.5 degrees. Those margins exist because the journey duration is uncertain. We don't know how long we'll be traveling. We don't know what we'll encounter. Reducing life support allocation increases mortality risk for everyone by 15%. Prometheus finally looked up, his golden eyes meeting Kronos' calculating gaze. "I've run the math. There is an 85% chance that everyone survives the journey at reduced specifications. But 100% chance 12 specific immortals die if we maintain current protocols. 12 individuals versus 564 slightly increased risks." "Yes." Prometheus's hands moved through the quantum fields, adjusting probability matrices at the subatomic level. Kara's, who has complete knowledge of agricultural symbiosis systems. Fallen, who specializes in pediatric medicine, will be needed when we start having children again. Marin, who understands terraforming at the biological level. The others, all essential in different ways. All excluded by our capacity calculations. All excluded by reality. The ship physically cannot. The ship can if we're willing to be slightly uncomfortable. The quantum field shimmered as Prometheus completed the modification. "There. Done. We now have space for 576 refugees instead of 564. Tell Thalia to add 12 names to the survivor list. Priority, specialized knowledge we don't have redundancy for." Kronos was silent for a long moment, his consciousness calculating risk factors, probability matrices, the cascading consequences of this decision. "If this kills us all, then we die trying to save everyone we can instead of some. I can live with that arithmetic." Prometheus smiled without humor. "Though obviously I'd prefer not to have to. You broke protocol. Rules are guidelines when lives are at stake. Always have been." Kronos left without another word. But 6 hours later, Thalia added 12 names to the survivor list, 12 immortals who would live because someone had been willing to bend physics and defy policy in equal measure. Later, much later, when they were deep in interstellar space and the reduced life support margins made everyone slightly less comfortable than they'd prefer, no one complained. Because everyone knew what those marginal discomforts had purchased: 12 lives, 12 essential skill sets, 12 beings who would help build something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. Prometheus never mentioned what he'd done. But Karas, who grew food that fed the refugees. Fallen, who delivered the first Earth-born immortal child. Marin, who would someday help make Earth's deserts bloom. They were living testimonies to the principle that sometimes rules existed to be broken in service of a higher mathematics. The mathematics of mercy rather than efficiency. How many? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Her healer's consciousness automatically calculated the mathematics even as she tried not to. She'd spent the last 3 days determining who would live and who would die, and the numbers were burned into her perfect memory like brands. 47 ships, Zephyrus replied, his golden eyes meeting hers with characteristic directness. His hands never stopped moving through the holographic controls, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the slight tremor in his fingers, which spoke to the emotional turmoil his stoic exterior refused to show. Each can carry maybe a dozen of us, with life support for perhaps a century of travel. Maybe longer if we implement stasis protocols, but... He didn't finish. They both knew what but meant. Stasis was unreliable, resource-intensive, and carried its own mortality rates. The mathematics of extinction were brutal and straightforward. Their population numbered in the millions, 3.7 million immortals spread across 12 orbital habitats, 4 planetary settlements, and the homeworld's 7 continents. The ships could barely save 500. Not 500,000. 500 individuals. The arithmetic screamed from the holographic displays like an accusation. 99.99% casualty rate, the most catastrophic loss in the recorded history of any spacefaring civilization. The selection protocols? Thalia's voice caught slightly despite her immortal discipline. As their chief medical officer, she had spent the last 3 days determining who would live and who would die. The weight of those choices felt heavier than mountains, denser than neutron stars, more crushing than the gravitational forces that were currently tearing their sun apart. She tried to be systematic and objective, following the criteria they'd established: genetic diversity to prevent bottleneck effects, skill sets optimized for survival and reconstruction, representative sampling across all philosophical schools to preserve their cultural complexity, and age distributions that would enable long-term viability. But every name on the survivor list meant 1,000 names that weren't. Thalia's immortal consciousness couldn't stop calculating even when she wanted it to. Total immortal population, 3,700,000. Evacuation capacity, 564. Casualty rate, 99.98%. But the raw percentage felt abstract, so her mind broke it down by function, by role, by the specific expertise that would be lost. Medical professionals, 47,000 total, saving 12 equals 99.97% loss. Every healer who had ever eased suffering, every researcher who had pushed the boundaries of biological understanding, every specialist who knew treatments for conditions that had taken millennia to master, gone. Educators, 89,000 total, saving 23 equals 99.97% loss. 20 million years of pedagogical refinement, teaching methods proven across epochs, the accumulated wisdom of how to nurture consciousness and foster growth, reduced to 23 individuals trying to remember everything their 88,977 colleagues had known. Engineers, 134,000 total, saving 47 equals 99.96% loss. Stellar architects, quantum mechanics, probability engineers, the builders who had constructed cities that floated on clouds and habitats that orbited black holes, their expertise would die with them. The calculations continued, merciless in their precision. Artists, 67,000 saved, non-essential. Musicians, 43,000 saved, non-essential. Philosophers, 89,003 saved, marginally essential. Historians, 54,008 saved, essential for cultural continuity. Each category told the same story: almost everything would be lost. The survivors would carry fragments of their civilization like refugees clutching photographs from a burning house, precious but incomplete, meaningful but insufficient, treasured remnants of a wholeness that could never be recovered. My mentor, staying behind. 4.7 million years old. The immortal who taught me that healing was a partnership rather than control, who showed me that medicine was as much about listening as it was about intervention, is a great teacher. She's in the central medical complex, helping organize triage even though she knows she won't survive it. My sister, not selected. Currently in Habitat 4, structural integrity is failing. She's a dancer, one of the finest the fourth epoch had produced. Her art could make gravity weep. Non-essential. My first student, teaching on the southern continent. Ground zero for the stellar radiation burst. He'll have maybe 6 hours. The student who proved to me that teaching could transcend species barriers, who showed me that wisdom could be nurtured even in young consciousness. Dead because I chose to save engineers over educators when I had to make impossible choices about who qualified as essential. 3 people she loved more than equations could express. 3 among 3,699,436 others. Each one a universe of experience, consciousness, and potential, snuffed out because mathematics demanded it. The selection protocols were complete. The morality of those protocols would haunt her forever. Complete. Kronos materialized beside them, his form flickering with the controlled energy that marked their kind, a subtle shimmer at his edges as if he couldn't quite commit to being entirely present in this moment of crisis. Where Zephyrus embodied physical precision and architectural mastery, Kronos was pure organizational intellect. Every decision was calculated, every outcome was predicted, and every variable was weighed with mechanical thoroughness. Genetic diversity maximized within available parameters. Skill sets optimized for survival and reconstruction scenarios. Representative sampling across all philosophical schools to preserve ideological complexity. He paused, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that most would have missed, but that Thalia's medical training caught immediately. It was the closest thing to emotional vulnerability she'd ever seen from their logistics master. It was the best we could do. Which means it was nowhere near good enough. Thalia's fingers moved unconsciously, touching each immortal's arm as they passed through the command center, not deliberately, but her healer's consciousness couldn't help cataloging bioelectric signatures, pulse rates elevated 12% above baseline, stress hormones marking every individual she encountered, cortisol levels indicating trauma processing in real time. Even immortals weren't immune to grief's physiological markers. Her medical sensors documented everything automatically, turning emotion into data, suffering into statistics she could understand and categorize, if not alleviate. Through the chamber's vast windows, Thalia could see more evacuation ships rising into the turbulent atmosphere. Some were standard transport vessels, sleek and efficient designs meant for comfortable interplanetary travel. Others were cobbled together from whatever materials remained, research stations stripped down to engines and life support, cargo haulers retrofitted with emergency hibernation pods, and even a few luxury yachts that had been militarized for desperate escape. Each vessel represented hundreds or thousands of hours of emergency engineering, with every one a calculated gamble that they could reach habitable systems before resources ran out. The dying sun painted everything in shades of crimson and shadow, transforming their familiar home world into something alien and threatening. The light that filtered through the command center's crystalline walls was wrong, too red, too angry, pulsing with irregular rhythms that made shadows dance like living things. Thalia's medical sensors detected dangerous radiation levels increasing exponentially with each solar convulsion. Within hours, the surface would be sterilized. Within days, the planet itself would be consumed. Erebus stood in shadows that seemed deeper around his form, his consciousness recording every detail with obsessive precision, 847 waiting for selection, 563 slots remaining, every name a choice between salvation and abandonment. His memory would preserve this forever, whether he wanted it to or not. Documentation was involuntary. The burden of perfect recall was that nothing could be forgotten, no horror dismissed, no failure erased. He watched, recorded, and knew that 50,000 years hence he would remember this moment with the same crystalline clarity he experienced now. The philosophical schools. Erebus had entered silently, as was his way. The tall, lean immortal seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, his dark presence a counterpoint to the other's luminous forms. Even now, in the final hours of their civilization, he wore the traditional robes of the observer school, deep black that made him look like a void cut into reality itself. Even in Exodus, we fragment ourselves. His voice carried the particular disdain he reserved for what he considered civilization's greatest weakness, the inability to unite under crisis, the insistence on maintaining philosophical divisions even when survival demanded cooperation. Thalia had worked with Erebus for centuries in the medical research centers, and she knew his critique came from genuine concern rather than mere cynicism. He had predicted something like this, perhaps not a stellar collapse specifically, but some catastrophic failure born from their civilization's overconfidence and internal divisions. The debate continues, Kronos acknowledged with a slight nod, his hands continuing to manipulate evacuation logistics even as he engaged in philosophical discussion. His multitasking capability was legendary. He could coordinate planetary-scale operations while simultaneously debating the most minute ethical issues. Some ships seek empty worlds for pure reconstruction. Others? He glanced at Thalia, and she felt the weight of his analytical gaze assessing her position. Others wish to find inhabited worlds where our knowledge might serve a greater purpose. Thalia felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had driven her through millennia of healing and research. Even here, even now, watching everything die, she couldn't escape the fundamental drive that defined her, the need to help, to heal, to nurture life wherever she found it. If we encounter younger civilizations, we could guide them. Help them avoid the mistakes that led to this? Erebus gestured toward the dying star with bitter irony, his long fingers cutting through the air like knives. Our guidance created the quantum resonance experiments that destabilized our sun. Perhaps other worlds would be safer without our help. Perhaps the most ethical thing we could do is find some empty planet and isolate ourselves from any species we might contaminate with our particular brand of wisdom. The criticism landed like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, Erebus was never cruel, but because it was accurate. The quantum resonance experiments that had triggered the stellar collapse had been presented as the next phase of their civilization's evolution, a means to harness stellar energy more efficiently and transcend the limitations of conventional power generation. The project had been supported by the best scientific minds, approved by democratic consensus, and implemented with every safety protocol their advanced civilization could devise. And it had killed their sun in 17 hours. The chamber shuddered as another stellar flare washed over their world, and Thalia's medical sensors screamed warnings about radiation exposure approaching lethal levels even for immortal physiology. Through the walls, she could sense the planet's electromagnetic field fluctuating wildly, struggling to maintain coherence against the assault from their dying star. They had minutes, not hours. The protective fields that shielded the command center were failing, as their energy reserves were depleting faster than the backup systems could compensate. Philosophical debates are a luxury we no longer possess, Zephyrus said, his architect's pragmatism cutting through the tension like a blade through fog. His hands moved through a final sequence of commands, and the holographic displays shifted to show the evacuation status: 47 ships, 564 passengers in total, 83% of essential supplies loaded, and life support systems at 92% functionality. The final ships launch in 60 seconds. We must choose our path. On the displays around them, Thalia could see the last evacuation ships departing from orbital platforms, surface installations, and the massive generation ships that had been under construction in the outer system. Each carried part of their collective knowledge, their history, their hopes, cultural archives containing 20 million years of accumulated wisdom. Genetic repositories preserve the biodiversity of their entire evolutionary lineage. Technological databases that might enable the reconstruction of their civilization in some distant world. The vessels scattered along different vectors, a diaspora of immortal refugees seeking new homes among the stars. Some headed towards stellar systems their astronomers had identified as potentially habitable, and others simply fled in random directions, hoping that probability and time would eventually deliver them to sanctuary. A few chose suicide vectors, diving into black holes or stellar cores rather than facing endless wandering through the void. Ship designation Sanctuary 7 is ready, Kronos reported, his voice maintaining professional neutrality despite everything. Our assigned vessel. 12 berths, full resource synthesis capability, and a quantum navigation system optimized for long-range travel. We're cleared for immediate departure. Thalia looked around the command chamber one final time, her perfect immortal memory recording every detail for preservation. This had been the heart of their civilization's most incredible city, the place where decisions affecting billions had been made with careful deliberation over centuries. The architecture alone represented millennia of aesthetic refinement, crystalline walls that could shift their molecular structure to create different acoustic properties. These bioluminescent panels responded to emotional states of occupants in gravity fields carefully tuned to provide optimal comfort for different physiological types. Now it would be dust in moments, reduced to ionized plasma when the stellar radiation finally overwhelmed the failing protective shields. The others? She asked, looking toward Zephyrus and Kronos. They had worked together for centuries, but she realized she didn't know which ships her other close colleagues had chosen, which paths her friends and mentors would follow into exile. Nyx took the observatory ship. She insists on continuing her stellar research. Zephyrus smiled slightly, and despite everything, Thalia found herself almost laughing at the characteristic stubbornness of their leader. Even as they fled extinction, Nyx remained curious about the universe, determined to understand the stellar mechanics that had destroyed their civilization. She's loaded it with every sensor package we could spare. Plans to study stellar phenomena during the journey, collect data that might prevent this from happening to other species. Prometheus chose the fastest vessel, Kronos added with apparent disapproval, his organizational mind offended by anything that prioritized speed over thorough planning. Claimed he wanted to reach a habitable system quickly to begin. Improvements. The pause before improvements carried worlds of concern. Prometheus was brilliant but reckless, a technological revolutionary who saw every problem as something to be fixed through aggressive innovation. The thought of him arriving at a primitive civilization with advanced technology and no oversight made Thalia's medical instincts scream out warnings. Korath took the defense ship, Erebus noted, stepping out of the shadows to join them more fully. Old habits. Still believes he can protect something. As they spoke, their assigned companions materialized in the chamber, responding to Kronos' final boarding call. Sophia arrived first, their master educator, her form shimmering with contained knowledge that made the air around her seem to hum with potential. She carried nothing physical, all her possessions were informational, cultural archives, and educational frameworks stored in crystalline memory matrices that resembled jewelry. Ether came next, the chronicler whose entire purpose was documentation and historical preservation. She was already recording these final moments, her enhanced perception capturing not just sights and sounds, but also electromagnetic patterns, quantum states, and even the emotional resonances of the assembled immortals. Everything would be preserved, archived, and analyzed by future historians who might learn from their civilization's final hours. Korath himself appeared last, solid and protective even in defeat. The warrior guardian's scarred form spoke of millennia spent defending their civilization from external threats, cosmic hazards, rogue AI systems, and the occasional hostile encounter with other spacefaring species. But all his combat prowess, all his strategic brilliance, all his dedication to protection couldn't defend against a sun that decided to die. He carried weapons anyway, plasma rifles, gravitational disruptors, even a few archaic bladed weapons that he'd collected across his long career as if arms might somehow protect them from the fundamental indifference of cosmic forces. The deck beneath them groaned as gravitational forces began tearing their world apart, with tidal stresses from the dying star pulling at the planet's core in ways that exceeded any material's ability to resist. Through the windows, Thalia watched the familiar landmarks of her eternal life crumble into incandescent debris. The towers, where she had conducted research that saved millions, were elegant spires of living crystal that housed the most advanced medical facilities in known space. The gardens where she had walked with Zephyrus through countless seasons, discussing architecture and healing, art and science, finding unexpected friendship in the overlap between their disciplines. The archives where Sophia had taught young immortals the wisdom of ages, vast libraries that contained not just data but understanding accumulated over 20 million years. All of it dissolving into superheated plasma as the star's death throes tore their world apart. Time, Zephyrus announced, his voice steady despite everything, even though a steady voice meant condemning everyone not in this chamber to death. His hands moved through the final transport protocols with the precise efficiency that had always characterized his work. They moved together toward the transport beam that would carry them to their ship, a column of shimmering light that represented the last technological miracle their dying civilization could provide. As the familiar tingle of matter transmission began, the sensation of being deconstructed atom by atom and reconstructed elsewhere, Thalia took one last look at their dying world. Through the crystalline walls, she could see their sun's final convulsion. The star that had warmed their world for 20 million years, that had enabled their civilization's rise from primitive origins to cosmic sophistication, that had been stable, reliable, and utterly trustworthy according to every astronomical model, was dying in a cascade of fusion failures that would sterilize everything within 10 light minutes. The blast of radiation that followed looked almost beautiful, a sphere of deadly light expanding at relativistic speeds, erasing everything it touched with impartial thoroughness. Cities vanished. Continents burned. Oceans boiled into a vacuum. The planet's atmosphere stripped away in seconds, the protective magnetic field collapsed, and the crust itself began to melt under the assault. Then they were aboard Sanctuary 7, looking through the ship's transparent hull at the expanding sphere of destruction that had been their home. Thalia's stomach lurched despite her immortal equilibrium as the vessel's quantum drives engaged with a harmonic thrum that she felt in her bones, carrying them away from everything they had ever known into the cold infinity of space. The ship itself was small by their civilization standards, maybe 30 meters from bow to stern, shaped like an aerodrop designed by someone who understood both aesthetics and fluid dynamics. The interior was cramped compared to the vast spaces they were accustomed to. Every cubic meter was optimized for long-duration survival. The command center, where they gathered, occupied the vessel's widest point. It was surrounded by sleeping quarters barely large enough for individual privacy, storage bays packed with compressed resources, and the massive drive assemblies that would carry them across interstellar distances. "Where do we go?" Sophia asked quietly, her usual confidence shaken by the magnitude of their loss. The master educator, who had taught thousands of students across the millennia, now sounded like a confused child asking for direction. Her hands trembled slightly as she accessed the ship's navigation systems. Zephyrus studied the star charts with professional focus. Still, Thalia could see the grief in his golden eyes and read the tension in his shoulders, which spoke to overwhelming loss barely contained behind practical necessity. They had worked together long enough that she'd learned to interpret his subtle emotional cues, the micro-expressions that most immortals suppressed, the tiny variations in posture that revealed inner turmoil, and the almost imperceptible changes in voice tone that indicated distress. The navigation system has identified 17 potentially habitable systems within reasonable range, he said, his architect's mind already analyzing structural problems even in stellar cartography. Some show no signs of intelligent life. Others? He hesitated, his hand hovering over specific coordinates. Others show electromagnetic signatures consistent with early technological civilizations. Kronos finished, his organizational systems having already processed the complete analysis. Radio transmissions at primitive frequencies. Atmospheric modifications suggesting industrial-scale activity. The signs of species beginning to reshape their worlds. Young civilizations, Thalia said, feeling something stir within her chest. Not quite hope, that would take time to rebuild, might never fully return after watching their entire civilization die. But purpose, perhaps. Direction. A reason to continue beyond mere survival. Species that might need guidance to avoid our mistakes. Or species that might be better left alone to find their own path, Erebus countered, his consciousness carrying the weight of opposition that would define their relationship for the next 50,000 years. Our guidance destroyed our own world. What right do we have to interfere with others? The ancient philosophical divide that had shaped their civilization for millennia was already reasserting itself, even in exile. Around the ship's command center, Thalia could see the others choosing sides with familiar patterns, Kronos and Sophia gravitating toward structured intervention, Nyx and Ether maintaining careful neutrality, Korth torn between protection and non-interference. But that debate would come later. For now, they were refugees among the stars, carrying the remnants of an immortal civilization toward an uncertain future. Whether they would become guardians, observers, or simply survivors remained to be seen. Through the ship's transparent hull, Thalia watched the light of their dying sun fade into just another point of illumination among the countless stars. The explosion that had consumed their world, that had killed billions of their people, that had erased 20 million years of accumulated wisdom and achievement, looked almost small from this distance, just another stellar event in a universe full of such catastrophes. Somewhere ahead lay worlds that might become new homes, species that might become new companions, and choices that would define not just their own survival but the fate of civilizations yet unknown. Behind them lay everything they had ever been, their history, their culture, their confidence in their own wisdom and capability. All of it reduced to memory and regret. Set course for the nearest inhabited system, Thalia said finally, making the choice that would echo across 50 millennia. If we're going to survive, let it be with purpose. We find a young civilization. We learn from our mistakes. And we try to ensure no one else pays the price for knowledge that comes too quickly or power that exceeds wisdom. Zephyrus input the coordinates with swift precision, and Sanctuary 7's quantum drives hummed with building energy. Around them, the other immortals settled into positions for long-duration transit, each lost in private grief for what they'd lost, private uncertainty about what they might find. As their ship accelerated toward an unknown blue world orbiting a yellow star in an unremarkable stellar system, Thalia stood at the observation window, watching their dead sun recede into the infinite darkness. The light that had sustained their civilization for 20 million years was dying behind them, but ahead lay other lights, other worlds, other possibilities. The journey into exile had begun. And with it, the first steps toward becoming something different than what they had been, no longer masters of their own destiny, but refugees seeking new purpose among the stars. 564 refugees. 47 ships. One blue world waiting below. They've escaped extinction. Now comes the harder question: what do traumatized refugees do when they find vulnerable populations who remind them of everything they couldn't save? Do they observe? Or do they intervene? In Chapter 2, the immortals arrive at Earth and discover it's not empty. 5 species of intelligent humans struggle through an ice age, completely unaware that beings with godlike power are watching from orbit. The philosophical debate from their dying world is about to become very, very real. That's Chapter 1 of The First Awakening. If you enjoyed this, hit the like button, it helps other listeners discover the series. Subscribe to AI Narratives and Tales for the next chapter, and leave a comment letting me know what you think. What would you do if you had the power to help but knew intervention might cause more harm than good? Drop your thoughts below. This is AI